In March 2020, the university switched to online teaching in light of the COVID-19 pandemic. After the initial peak, prevalence of COVID-19 had remained relatively low over the summer vacation prior to the start of the next academic year. It was anticipated that there would be an increase in prevalence after initial restrictions had lifted and students returned in mixed. As part of this, an asymptomatic screening programme was envisioned to provide visibility of transmission between students and allow the university to take targeted actions. The initial goal of the programme was to test all students living in college accommodation, a total of over 16,000 people. The programme's clinical leads, Nick Matheson and Ben Warne, proposed implementing a pooled testing programme, wherein 8 to 10 student swabs would be grouped into a single test, and only if the pooled result was positive would those students be individually tested.
The high-level logistics plan settled on for this program was relatively simple and linear. It started with the procurement of parts and the manufacturing of test kits for the pooled sampling. Those kits were then distributed to the colleges. The students then took their swab samples, and then the used or completed test kits were couriered on from the colleges to the testing lab. And finally, the samples were then PCR tested so the results could be handled and distributed. Colleges needed to be able to manage the last mile distribution and collection of test kits to students, and the student pools needed to be correctly administered and submit their tests. This created large numbers of opportunities for multiple uncontrolled failure modes, from late submission and incorrectly packaged samples to unforeseen IT problems.
The pooled tests kit came in a brown envelope and contained multiple swabs which were all deposited into a single tube at the time of swabbing, grouping that pool into a single result. The kits were supplied to pools of students in both college and private accommodation. If one people in the pool had COVID, the test would return positive. Only then would individual follow-on tests be issued to that specific pool to determine who the positive members of the pool were. By pooling students, the number of PCR laboratory tests that needed to be performed was reduced by a factor between 5 and 10 times. The University Messenger Service, or UMS, is the university's internal courier service. In keeping with the program's approach to using latent resources, UMS provided access to 2 couriers who did all of the physical moving of test kits for the program. They were responsible for getting new test kits from production to colleges and for getting used test kits from colleges to the lab.
The UMS courier dropped off and scanned in their delivery for the day. Excalibur's first task was to sort and separate out all potentially void samples, for example, improperly packaged or leaking tubes. The tubes were then unpackaged and held in lab rags. At this point, the tube barcodes were scanned to associate their ID with their tray location. The samples were then transferred with a pipette into a smaller tray and heat treated at 60 degrees Celsius for 10 minutes, followed by a thermal shock treatment of 90 degrees Celsius for 1 minute to inactivate the virus. A universal lab robot was used to pipette PCR reagent into a second lab tray, followed by another lab robot that batch pipettes the student samples into the PCR reagent tray. The samples were then centrifuged and a positive control was pipetted into 4 reserved tray cells. The PCR test cycle was then run. The following morning, results were assigned to their respective sample barcodes and the data transferred to a secure server hosted by the University Clinical School on the biomedical campus. Here they were matched to the personal details of each student. Results were sent to individuals by text message and, if positive, followed up by contact from the programme's clinical support team.
Built by a small army of developers from the University Information Services during the programme's initial phase, the programme's IT backend provided a highly robust and reliable system to underpin all the critical activities and tracking required to produce test kits, test students for COVID and supply them with the results. The system consisted of an Azure database backend, acting as a single source of truth for all kit production, student, household and pool data, pool and student test kit usage, and results distribution. Students simply scanned a QR code on a test kit to register their participation in that specific kit, and because the test tube inside the kit was registered to the same test kit during production, results received from the lab could be linked back to students and their pools, meaning that results could be issued through an automated email or text message service.
Over the course of delivering more than 80,000 test kits to students, the programme has faced many operating challenges. A lot of them could be considered typical challenges for operations managers, but the nature of the evolving pandemic, along with the degree of uncertainty throughout the programme's life cycle, meant that some were particularly problematic. The programme faced component delays from suppliers in China, India and Belgium, and the reasons for these varied from factory fires to COVID waves spreading in those suppliers' countries that resulted in legislated export restrictions. At one point, this meant even our backup supplier for a certain part couldn't source inventory, requiring a joint sourcing effort from the programme coordination team and our laboratory testing partner to source that component from another supplier, but making sure that it was still compatible with the standard of the process we were running.
As logistics chains go, this system was really quite challenging because of the people, i.e. the students, in the middle of the process, playing an integral role in its success or failure. And the closed loop nature of the logistics chain, so moving test kits out to students and then receiving completed sample kits back from the students, was similar in some ways to the more sustainable closed loop supply chains, which are now becoming more common in the industrial space as well.